Welcome to our justice. Some men lose their wives, some men lose their homes. I lost both on the same afternoon, and I didn't even see it coming until a school nurse handed me a piece of paper with a blood type that didn't belong to me. My name is Alan. I'm 41 years old, and for most of my adult life I considered myself a careful man. Not paranoid, not controlling, just careful. I grew up watching my father trust people too quickly and pay for it in ways that never fully healed, so I made a quiet promise to myself early on. I would always pay attention. I would always notice things. I thought that promise had protected me. I was wrong. This story begins 7 years before the courtroom, before the DNA test, before the lawyer who went silent in front of a judge. It begins on a Thursday evening in September at a neighborhood barbecue where I met a woman named Carolyn. Carolyn was the kind of person who made every room feel warmer. She had this unhurried way of talking to people, like she had all the time in the world and you were the most interesting part of it. I was 34, newly promoted at my civil engineering firm, and I hadn't been in a serious relationship in almost 2 years. I told myself I wasn't looking, but I was looking. I just wasn't admitting it. We dated for 11 months. She moved in after 8. We got married in a small ceremony with about 40 people in a garden venue outside the city. Her parents were kind. Her friends were warm. Everything about Carolyn felt like something I'd waited a long time to find. Our daughter, Lily, was born 18 months into the marriage, and for the next 5 years, I was the happiest I'd ever been. I need you to understand that part because what comes later is easier to absorb if you know what I believed was true. I wasn't in a bad marriage looking for reasons to leave. I wasn't suspicious. I wasn't distant. I coached Lily's weekend soccer team. I cooked dinner 3 nights a week. I drove Carolyn to her sister's house on holidays even when I was exhausted. I was present. I was all in. The first crack appeared on an ordinary Tuesday. Lily was 6 years old, in first grade at a public school about 4 miles from our house. I got a call at work at around 2005 in the afternoon from the school nurse, a woman named Mrs. Okafor. She was calm but firm. Lily had fainted during afternoon recess. She was conscious now, sitting in the nurse's office, drinking water. They needed me to come in, and they needed Carolyn to call immediately. I was out of my office in under 3 minutes. When I arrived, Lily was sitting on a padded cot with a foil emergency blanket around her shoulders even though it wasn't cold. She looked pale, but she gave me a small smile when she saw me, and something inside me unknotted just slightly. Mrs. Okafor met me at the door. She explained that fainting in young children during outdoor activity wasn't automatically alarming, but given that it was Lily's second dizzy episode in 3 weeks, she wanted to make sure they had complete medical information on file. She asked me to review the emergency health form they had for Lily. Standard procedure, she said. She needed to verify blood type, allergy flags, any family medical history that might be relevant. She handed me the form. I looked at it, and I stood there for a moment longer than made sense. The blood type listed on Lily's form was B positive. My blood type is O positive. 2 O positive parents cannot have a B positive child. I know this because I have a degree in engineering and a basic memory of high school biology. I know this because I have a medical alert card in my wallet that I've carried for 12 years. I know this because it's one of the simplest and most fundamental facts in human genetics. I stood in that nurse's office and I felt the floor shift slightly under my feet. Mrs. Okafor was still talking. She was asking about family history of fainting spells, asking whether Lily had eaten lunch that day, asking if there was any recent illness I knew about. I answered her. I don't fully remember what I said, but I answered her, because that is what you do when you are a careful man who has just felt his entire life tilt on its axis. You keep functioning. You do not fall apart in a school nurse's office in front of your 6-year-old daughter. I signed what I needed to sign. I collected Lily. I called Carolyn on the way to the car and told her Lily was fine, just a dizzy spell. The school wanted her to rest at home. Carolyn said she'd be there by the time we got back. In the car, Lily fell asleep in her booster seat within 10 minutes. I drove home in silence. I want to tell you what I was thinking during that drive, but the truth is I wasn't thinking in sentences. It was more like a series of images. Carolyn at our wedding, the first time I held Lily in the hospital. A conversation we'd had maybe 2 years into our marriage about how she sometimes struggled to be home on time on Thursday evenings because of a networking group she joined for work. A name I'd heard her mention a few times casually, a colleague named Paul, who she'd stopped mentioning around the time Lily turned 3. None of that was proof of anything. I knew that. But I also knew that B positive and O positive do not make B positive. That evening I put Lily to bed. Carolyn sat beside me on the edge of Lily's bed while Lily drifted off, and I watched my wife's face in the soft lamplight of my daughter's room, and I felt something I can only describe as grief arriving early. Like grief for something that hadn't been confirmed yet, but that you already know, somewhere deep and certain, is true. I didn't say anything that night. This is one of the decisions I've been asked about most often since. Why didn't I confront her immediately? Why did I wait? Here's the answer. I had watched men confront women with suspicions before. I had watched them get tearful denials, elaborate explanations, counter-accusations designed to make the man look paranoid and controlling. I had watched evidence disappear when people knew they were being watched. I had watched confrontations that destroyed any legal advantage the wronged party might have had. I was not going to make those mistakes. If there was a truth here, I was going to find it completely. I was going to know it completely. And when the moment came to deal with it, I was going to deal with it from a position of knowledge, not suspicion. The next morning, I called my doctor. I said I was helping my daughter complete some school health paperwork and I needed to confirm both our blood types. He confirmed mine, O positive. He told me to have Lily tested by her pediatrician, which I arranged within 2 days. Lily's result came back, B positive. That was the confirmation I had not allowed myself to hope was wrong. Now I needed to understand fully what I was dealing with before I did anything else. Over the next 3 months, I moved carefully. I opened a separate bank account at a different institution and began quietly diverting a small percentage of my paycheck into it each month, enough to build a legal fund without Carolyn noticing anything unusual in our household spending. I want to be clear about how I was able to do this. I had received a performance bonus 4 months earlier that I had deposited into our joint savings account. I told Carolyn I would manage the quarterly tax payments from it. That gave me legitimate control over a portion of funds without raising any questions. I consulted a family law attorney, a woman named Helen Marsh, in a city about 40 miles from where we lived, specifically so there was no chance Carolyn would encounter her name in any local network. Helen was precise, unhurried, and deeply experienced. She told me exactly what I needed and what I didn't. She told me a DNA test, obtained legally and handled properly, would be the foundation of everything. She told me to document any financial information I had access to now, because access could change quickly once legal proceedings began. I followed her instructions exactly. The DNA test was the part that took the most emotional preparation. Lily is my daughter. Whatever the biology says, she is mine in every way that has mattered for 6 years. I want to be clear about that. The test wasn't about Lily. It was about me needing to know the truth of what Carolyn had done so that I could make informed decisions about my own life, my legal standing, and my daughter's future stability. I used a home paternity testing kit, the kind that comes with cheek swabs and a prepaid return envelope. I swabbed Lily's cheek one morning while she was eating breakfast and she thought it was a funny game. I submitted both samples to the lab under my name and a reference number. The results came back 17 days later. The probability of paternity, 0.0%. I sat in my car in a parking garage and I read that number 3 times. Then I put the paper back in the envelope, placed the envelope in my briefcase, drove to Helen Marsh's office, and handed it to her paralegal. That was the beginning of a legal process. What I still didn't have was the identity of Lily's biological father, and I want to explain why that mattered to me, not for revenge, not to expose anyone, but because in a custody and asset division proceeding, the more complete picture I had, the stronger my position would be. Helen agreed. I hired a private investigator for 6 weeks. His name was Terry, and he was a retired county sheriff's deputy who had been doing domestic investigation work for 11 years. He was not dramatic. He was methodical and quiet, which is exactly what I needed. What Terry found over those 6 weeks was this. Carolyn had maintained a relationship with a man named Paul Adayemi for approximately 4 years. Paul was a regional account manager at a company her firm had done business with. They had met through a professional introduction. The relationship had continued through Lily's conception and for at least a year and a half afterward, at which point, based on Terry's observation and Carolyn's phone records from a period when she had briefly used a shared family plan I had access to, the contact had tapered significantly. Whether the relationship was still ongoing at the point I hired Terry, he couldn't say definitively. But 4 years of documentation, hotel receipts, and a series of messages on an old shared device that Carolyn had forgotten contained a cloud backup I could still legally access as an account co-holder told enough of the story. I had everything I needed. Now came the hardest stretch, continuing to live in that house, sleeping in that bed, sitting across from Carolyn at dinner, watching her read to Lily on the couch, and saying nothing. I will not pretend that was easy. It was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. Not because of anger, though the anger was there, quiet and constant like something burning at low heat, but because of grief. Grief for the marriage I thought I had, grief for the version of my life I had believed in completely, and a particular complicated grief for Lily because Lily didn't know anything. Lily just knew that Daddy came home every evening and Mommy made her laugh and everything was fine. I protected that for her as long as I could. I filed for divorce 5 months after the nurse handed me that form. Carolyn was served at our home on a Wednesday morning. I had arranged to be at work. Helen had advised against me being present for the service. When I came home that evening, Carolyn was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands folded, and the look on her face was one I had never seen before, something between fear and calculation. She said, "Helen, we need to talk about this." I said. We'll talk through our attorneys. And I went upstairs to check on Lily. The divorce proceedings took 9 months. I want to walk you through the parts that matter because this is where the story becomes something larger than just my marriage. Carolyn's attorney was a man named Gerald Finch, and he was aggressive from the beginning. The early argument from their side was that I had abandoned emotional investment in the marriage, that I had become distant and cold in the months before filing, and that this had damaged Carolyn's well-being. It was the setup for a narrative where she was the neglected spouse and I was the checked-out husband. It was also, in a technical sense, partially true. I had been emotionally withdrawn in the months leading up to the filing because I was sitting on the knowledge of what she had done and choosing not to act on it prematurely. Gerald Finch also argued, in the context of asset division, that Carolyn deserved a significant share of the equity in our home, which I had purchased 3 years before we married and added her name to 18 months after the wedding. In most jurisdictions, marital home equity accumulated during the marriage is subject to division. Helen had been clear with me about this. I was not going to win that argument outright. What I was going to do was shift the entire nature of the proceeding. The hearing that changed everything happened on a Friday morning in March. The courtroom was small, a family courtroom, not a dramatic televised chamber. There were maybe 12 people present, including attorneys and court staff. Carolyn sat across the room in a navy blazer. She had not looked at me once since we'd entered. Gerald Finch was in the middle of presenting Carolyn's contribution to the marital household, her income, her domestic labor, her role as primary caregiver, when Helen requested permission to enter a series of documents into evidence. The judge, an older man named Judge Carver, reviewed the documents briefly before Finch could object. Then he looked up. He looked at Carolyn's table first, then at me. Then he said something I will remember for the rest of my life. Counselor Finch, I'm going to give you a moment to review what's been submitted. I suggest you take it. The documents included the paternity test results, processed by a certified laboratory and bearing chain of custody documentation that Helen's office had carefully maintained, a declaration from the testing laboratory confirming the methodology and outcome, the blood type discrepancy report from the school nurse's office obtained through a signed release, a portion of the private investigator's report, specifically the documented timeline of contact between Carolyn and Paul Adeyemi with corroborating photographic evidence collected in public spaces. Gerald Finch went quiet in a way I had not seen him go quiet in 9 months of proceedings. He asked for a recess. Judge Carver granted 15 minutes. During that 15 minutes, I sat with Helen at our table and she said nothing to me. She didn't need to. She had built the case for 9 months for exactly this moment. She knew what those documents meant in the context of asset division and custody. In many jurisdictions, marital misconduct, particularly proven infidelity, can influence the court's view of asset division and, more importantly, can affect determinations around moral fitness in custody arrangements. Helen had argued strategically, not emotionally. She wasn't trying to destroy Carolyn. She was trying to ensure that the court had a complete and accurate picture of the marriage it was being asked to adjudicate. When a recess ended, Gerald Finch's posture was different. Within 2 weeks of that hearing, Carolyn's legal team requested a negotiated settlement rather than proceeding to full trial. The settlement terms were these: I retained primary physical custody of Lily. Carolyn retained joint legal custody and received generous, structured parenting time. The marital home equity was divided, but with a significantly reduced share going to Carolyn than her team had originally sought. And Helen had negotiated a structured buyout that allowed me to keep the house, which I valued not for its financial worth, but because it was Lily's home and I was not going to disrupt her life any more than it had already been disrupted. Carolyn received a fair settlement in terms of shared savings accumulated during the marriage. Helen had advised me not to try to claw back everything. The goal was stability and justice, not war. Paul Adeyemi was not a party to the proceedings. That was not my battle to fight in that room. What happened after the settlement is something I want to describe carefully because I think it matters for anyone listening who is in or near a situation like this one. Lily is 8 years old now. She knows her parents are not together anymore. She does not know the full story, and she won't until she is old enough to understand it in a way that doesn't harm her. I have made a decision, in consultation with a family therapist, that the truth of her biological parentage is a conversation for when she's an adult. It is not a secret I will keep from her forever. But she is 8 years old, and she deserves a childhood that isn't defined by the mistakes of the adults in her life. Carolyn and I are not friendly, but we are civil. We have to be, for Lily. And most of the time, we manage it. I have moved into a smaller house 3 blocks from Lily's school. It has a backyard with a cherry tree and a fence that I painted myself over a weekend in August. Lily has a room there with yellow curtains she picked out and a bookshelf that's already overflowing. I am not angry anymore. I want to be clear about that. The anger was present for a long time, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It was earned, But anger is expensive. It costs you sleep and presence and the ability to enjoy ordinary things. At some point, I stopped spending it. Not because I forgave everything, I'm not sure I have, but because I decided that Lily deserved a father who was present and steady, and that version of me couldn't coexist with a man who was still burning. I think often about the moment in the nurse's office when I looked at that form. Mrs. Okafor had no idea what she handed me that afternoon. She was doing her job. She wanted to make sure a little girl who had fainted on the playground had all her medical information correctly logged. She was careful and kind, and that carefulness, that ordinary professional attentiveness, is the thing that unraveled 7 years of a hidden truth. I don't think the truth was ever really hidden. I think it was just waiting for the right ordinary moment to become visible. I've thought about what I would say if I ever spoke to Paul Adeyemi. I don't think I will. He's not part of my story. He was part of Carolyn's choices, and those choices are hers to carry. What I know is that he has no relationship with Lily and has not sought one, which, for reasons I've made peace with, is probably for the best right now. I've thought about what I would say to a younger version of myself, the 34-year-old at a barbecue who saw a woman laughing in the evening light and felt something shift. I wouldn't take that moment back. I would not go back and walk away, because that path still led to Lily, and Lily is not a mistake. She is the best thing in my life, regardless of biology, regardless of everything. What I would tell that younger version of myself is simpler than any piece of advice about women or trust or marriage. I would say, pay attention, not obsessively, not with suspicion and surveillance and fear, but pay attention to the small things, the blood type on a form, the name that stops being mentioned, the Thursday evenings that never quite added up. The small things, when you actually look at them, have a way of telling the complete truth. I paid attention, and when the moment came, I was ready. There's one more thing I want to say before I close this out. Several people, friends, my older brother, a colleague who went through something similar, told me during those 9 months of waiting that I should have confronted Carolyn immediately. That silence was weakness. That waiting was cowardice dressed up as strategy. I understand why they felt that way. Emotionally, the impulse to confront is almost overwhelming. It feels like action. It feels like refusing to be a passive victim. But here is what I know from the other side of it. Confrontation without documentation, without legal preparation, without a clear head. Confrontation is a gift to the person who has wronged you. It warns them. It gives them time to move money, delete messages, build a counter-narrative, and position themselves as the reasonable party while you look like the volatile one. I did not give Carolyn that gift. I gave her a process server on a Wednesday morning and a courtroom 9 months later where a judge saw the full picture before Gerald Finch could build a wall around half of it. That is not coldness. That is not cruelty. That is what it looks like when a man who has been lied to for years decides to stop being the person who absorbs the consequences of someone else's choices and starts being the person who determines his own outcome. I am still that careful man. I always was. I was just careful in the right direction this time. Thank you for listening to Our Justice. If this story reached you, if it reflected something you've lived or something you feared, please share it. Leave a comment. Someone in your circle may need to hear that patience and preparation are not the same as weakness. They are, in fact, the only tools that actually work. I'll see you in the next one.